Hi, this is Carrie with Carrie Concealed in the Active Self-Protection Extra channel, and today I have a special guest, and this is number 2 born Dudenhofer man, Toby Dudenhofer, and this is my son's oldest son, second in the family, and he and his lovely, amazing wife, Miss Andrea, are visiting us this weekend, and I thought that it would be fun to talk to Toby about some of the experiences he had as a very young man. You were 19, 20?
I was 20 when I started working, turned 21 while I was working.
Okay, so 21-year-old working in a gun store, the only person in the store in a rural town in eastern Washington state, and just the things that you learned and experienced while you were working in the gun store helping people buy their guns.
This is not a paid endorsement, but I am a brand ambassador for Heckler and Koch USA. HK firearms are incredibly reliable, incredibly accurate, great firearms for defensive carry. From the new VP9A1 to the CC9 to the P30 that I have carried every day for the last 8 years, they are incredible firearms for defensive use. You carry a gun just in case. Shouldn't it be an HK just in case?
So the first question I thought I would ask Toby about is, so when you worked at a gun store, you also were living at home. So I got to hear some of the amazing experiences, amazing negative and amazing positive experiences.
And the good stories.
Yeah, and the good stories that you had while you were working. And so one of the things that surprised me is people's understanding about the gun that they owned, as far as holster, magazine. So what are some of the things people would ask when they would walk into the store?
The most common thing that I had was people would come in and ask for either like a holster, they're looking for another magazine for their Smith & Wesson 9mm, which can be
Which Smith & Wesson 9mm?
of any 100 guns you want to take a pick of. And that was all they knew. I would try to ask more questions, try to figure out, like, does it look like any of the ones that are in the case? Can we? And then they would point at the Glock.
Of course.
So just trying to narrow it down, but they genuinely did not know.
Yeah.
And I think that also painted a perception that it was really hard to find magazines for their gun or holsters for their gun because they didn't know, and they would go into other places, try to find holsters, magazines. They couldn't find them, but it's also because they didn't know the model of their gun.
So yeah, they didn't know that their gun was a specific
right. So it seemed a lot harder,
Smith & Wesson.
but if you had been able to tell the person in the store make, model, serial number, barrel length, any other special edition thing it might have had, then it would have been a whole lot easier to find a holster or a magazine.
Sure. How often would you say that I mean, I have an idea in my head how often it was a problem, or not a problem, but how often they'd come in. But ballpark, how often do you think, I mean, we're talking like weekly, monthly?
More than weekly. I work there 3 days a week, and it would happen more than once a week.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes total sense. Okay, one of the other things that, not happened, but was happening is an ammunition, well, I'll just say RIP ammunition, which stood for radically invasive projectile. And we had some folks that really wanted me to push that on my students. And it actually said RIP on the package, what have you. And you would have folks in that gun store sold some of that ammunition, small town gun store. You didn't control what was sold and what wasn't sold. But you had some folks that would come in, and just the fact that the RIP ammo, which would have those like spears or shards that would break apart, that became a confusing point for some of the people that came into the store.
Yeah, so a lot of people would come in and get excited when they'd see a box of frangible ammunition, because frangible ammunition also fragments, and that was the key marketing term of the RIP ammunition, is that it would fragment out upon impact, or whatever they wanted to say.
Yes.
So, which of course, frangible ammunition is a powder that's like copper and whatever,
compressed,
different things mixed together. And then when it would hit like a steel target or something, it would just turn into powder rather than leaving behind a chunk of lead or a piece of copper that can come flying back at you or something like that. And it's usually used in like shoot houses and stuff like that,
and for steel, shooting at steel close range, that's right. And ranges where they don't want, so my very first time at Thunder Ranch, you had to have frangible because they wanted it to be a lead-free range. And so you had to buy frangible for that. So
so they would get excited when they see that. They would think that it would make a good like self-defense load for home defense for their concealed carry gun, something like that, because it was frangible and it fragmented. And so those were some interesting conversations.
Well, and I think your role, and Toby, for those that don't know Toby, you have such a kind heart when you're telling people things and helping them understand things. But I could see how confusing that would be, because
yeah, I can understand
fragment, frangible, that doesn't sound very different. And I just remember the rifle club that we help out at. There were many members of the rifle club that when I was going to Thunder Ranch the first time and I was asking, hey, do you know where I can buy some frangible ammunition? They had no idea what I was talking about. These are men that are, older than my grandpa that had never heard of that before. So it's confusing.
I think even some of the boxes of frangible ammunition that we sold said like fragments or fragments into whatever, or safe because of whatever they want to say on the box.
That makes sense.
So yeah, I can completely understand also how it would be confusing.
Yeah. We'll have a deliverable or a downloadable thing that is a picture of an X-ray of somebody I was in the Coast Guard with, actually, who sent me an X-ray from someone who was struck with a round of RIP ammo and where those little pieces went in their body. And that's not a positive thing, but just what it does, and that's why people were so enamored by it. Good stuff. Okay, Tobes, what about people and their guns' value versus the value of the guns they would see in the case?
So at the small town gun store, of course, it was, I'm trying to remember the exact times. It was during the ammo shortage and the gun shortage back
during
COVID time.
Yeah, for sure during COVID.
And so it was hard to get hold of stuff. So the store had a lot of used guns while I was working there. And the used guns were always interesting, and it was fascinating to find. You would find some that were worth a lot more than you would ever thought, and some that were worth what you'd expect. And sometimes you'd have two sitting right next to each other that look exactly the same, and one of them is worth $400 or $500, the other one is worth $1,200.
Yeah, true.
And so sometimes people would be looking in the case and say, hey, I have a gun that looks exactly like that, thinking that it was worth $1,200, something like that. And then they would come in and want an appraisal on it and be upset when I would tell them that it's only worth $300, $400, $500, like a fairly average handgun price.
Yeah.
And
back then, average price back then.
Right, yeah,
that's changed a lot. But true.
Which that kind of relates back to knowing the gun you have, the model you have, the values of it, different things like that. So.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we try to talk about in classes often is that we're a nation of gun buyers, not necessarily a nation of shooters. And if you look at the number of rounds of ammunition that are sold per year compared to the number of guns sold and the number of guns owned, not in years where large agencies are buying lots of rounds of ammunition, but there was a study done by, I believe, Smith & Wesson in the 80s, and there's been other studies done that showed that, and you've heard this many times, you poor thing, but that 85% of the guns purchased in America are not shot in the lifetime of the gun. Of the 15% that are shot, less than 1% have more than 100 rounds put through them. And it makes sense. Like, once I heard that stat, which I heard long before you started working at the gun store, but your experiences there definitely supported that. People not really understanding what they had. They didn't shoot what they had. They didn't even know what they had for the most part.
Yeah, and a lot of times you get in used guns that look almost brand new, and if you know the statistics, you know that they have probably had a couple of rounds shot through them. They're really worried about buying a used gun. Because it's going to be pretty darn close to getting a new one, and the value is going to be a bit less too because it's used.
Yeah, right. Yep, exactly. Yeah, Mr. Jesse Johnson, he helps out with ASP National Conference, amazing instructor as well, and he talks about the common guns they have returned to them. And the sad thing is, once a gun has had even one round through it, it's now a used gun, and they cannot sell it as a new gun, even though figuratively it is brand new. But they cannot sell it.
And guns are test fired, so does that count? Does it not count?
Oh, good point. Good point, Toby.
At least we don't.
Very good point. No, they are. You're right there. I can't say for all of them, but the brands we're most familiar with, yes. All right. One other thing. What about the folks that was important to them to have one gun that could shoot multiple calibers?
Yeah.
Did you see a lot of people that was important to them?
A lot of them, it was important. Sometimes they wouldn't necessarily seek it out, but then they would get really excited when they saw one or they were interested in a gun that you could shoot two different calibers in or something like that. It gave it more value to them somehow.
Okay.
And I never exactly understood why. That. I mean, I guess it does make sense where if you can't, like if you're trying to find ammo for your 357, all they have on the shelf is 38 Special. Sure, the 38 Special will work.
And yet, how often in America has that happened? Probably not that many times in the history of America.
If you have one, you have the other pretty much.
Yeah.
There was also some people that were incorrect. that I don't want to say for sure because I'm not.
You don't have to say the calibers.
I can't guarantee that they were incorrect,
Sure.
but I'm pretty sure
you would look it up, you'd research, you'd ask questions, and couldn't find a way.
One size that they stated was significantly larger than another.
Yeah, and they'd say, "Oh, I can shoot these 2 rounds through this," and we're talking rifles, through the same gun, and I remember that would be, you're a researcher, and you'd look stuff up, and you try to find, and you have lots of folks that you can call and ask in the industry, and they'd be like, "No." Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I'm going to ask you this last question, and then we're going to stop this video, and then we're going to do part 2. Okay. That's okay with you? All right. So, and I know that you won't talk a lot about the classes you've taken, but you've had a fair amount of training, especially for somebody your age.
Yeah.
And it's an important topic to you and an important subject you care a lot about, and you want to be conscientious and safe. What was it like working in a gun store where you're the only person there and you do know a lot about how to safely handle firearms, meaning safely, but also for defensive purposes? What was it like dealing with folks that thought you were like the gun counter, like big box stores? So we have big box retailers. What was that like? I can't imagine what it was like for you starting out. And
it was interesting, and there was a little bit of a learning curve to that because I usually would kind of hold back until I found out the person was actually going to listen to what I had to say or not.
Fair. Good point.
And so sometimes I would just agree with them and shoot the crap for a little while in whatever form that they wanted to do that. And then other times, if people were asking questions and they kept pursuing and kept asking questions and follow-up questions, then I was more than happy to share the things that I knew and the things that I learned.
Yeah.
And the different things that I had learned from you and helping teaching ladies and how that's so much different than guys and everything that goes into that. But yeah, that was difficult, kind of almost feeling trapped in a world where I don't want to say I knew more than everybody else because there were different people knew. There's so much more to gun knowledge, and there's people that knew so much more about guns than I did, but I also knew so much more about the thing that we were talking about than they did.
Right. Well, especially because if you have a pocket of trap shooters, they know that, like in an area like we were in.
Right.
But that's
and I don't
different.
know much about shotgun, and I will be more than happy to admit that I know very little about shotgun.
Yeah. Although you own several and you shoot really well and what have you, but
depends on that.
But yeah, and you were the young guy, right?
Right. That was the other factor, is that it was a little strange. People had a hard time listening to the young guy, especially the older guys.
Yeah.
Had a hard time listening to what the younger guy had to say, which I understand.
Sure.
I honestly can't blame them. The attitude that they took on that was telling sometimes and often frustrating, but it's part of working in a retail environment.
Sure, that's true. Tobes, I think that you never did try growing a goatee like Daddy did when you worked in the emergency rooms, and the cute little blue-haired ladies would say, you can't even be out of high school, they would say. So Daddy tried growing a goatee so he'd look older, and they never fell for it. But maybe that would have worked for you, I don't know.
No, I could put a hat on and look a year older maybe. But
That's true. All right, well, thanks for your time. Let's come back for part 2, if you're willing to do that.
Sounds good.
All right, join us next week for part 2.